The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
Live from the State Capitol building in Boise, the State of the State speech of Idaho Governor John V. Evans. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marc Johnson. The scene is the chambers of the Idaho House of Representatives, where today the 47th Idaho Legislature convenes and the governor delivers the major address that traditionally marks the kickoff of a legislative session. The scene you see is members of the 47th Idaho Senate filing into the House chambers where this afternoon's joint session of the Idaho House and Senate will take place. This is a day, of course, of great pomp and ceremony as a legislative session opens. It is also, though, perhaps more than normally this year, a day of considerable high drama in terms of what this legislature will have to grapple with. It's been suggested already that the problems facing the Idaho legislature this year are as difficult difficult set of problems as any legislature has faced in perhaps half a century. Again, those are members of the Idaho Senate who are walking across the Capitol Rotunda to take their places in temporary seating that's provided down in the well of the House for them. The governor will be arriving shortly to give what traditionally is his major policy speech, really the only time during the course of a legislative session that the governor speaks to the entire legislature. And again, it's a very traditional ceremony type day, but also a day of the governor sketching out a good deal of his policy. The governor is expected to talk about a number of things today, a number of things that he's already talked about and of course have been in the newspapers and on television across Idaho for the last several weeks. He will give some more specifics on his plan for meeting what is projected to be, he projects to be, a $47 million budget deficit that the state of Idaho is facing. Republicans and some others believe that that deficit could be even greater than that, perhaps as much as $70 million. He's expected also to talk at some length today about his desire to maintain a quality educational system in Idaho, both in the public school and higher education. And of course, this speech in a symbolic way is designed to set the stage for cooperation with a legislature that, of course, is overwhelmingly Republican. State Senator Roger Fairchild there, right in the middle of the screen, a Republican from Fruitland, Democrat Norma Dobler from Moscow, John Peavy, caucus chairman, Democratic caucus chairman, Majority Leader Marc of Rexburg, some of the members of the Idaho legislature who are in their seats waiting for the arrival of first some of the state elected officials who are also in attendance and will be in attendance for this speech today, and later on the arrival of the members of the state Supreme Court. One of the things that the legislature does, and it's again, it goes back to the tradition that's associated with this opening day of the legislature. Both the House and Senate appoint committees of members of both bodies to, as they say in the legislative jargon, wait on the governor. He is escorted from his suite of offices on the second floor to the third floor where the House chamber is located in the State Capitol building. Tradition dictates, and the separation of powers in a way demands, that the governor not visit the legislative floor, the third floor of the State Capitol, except at the invitation of legislative leaders themselves. And of course, that's what he will be doing here shortly. I mentioned all of the state's elected officials will be on hand here today, including two who will be in new roles for the first time, Lieutenant Governor David Leroy and Attorney General Jim Jones, both appearing here for the first time in new jobs. The legislative drama was heightened just a bit today by a demonstration of sorts that, as we speak to you, is taking place on the steps of the State Capitol building. A People's March down Capitol Boulevard, the wide boulevard that runs sort of right through the middle of downtown Boise. was occupied by 100 or so marchers earlier today as they came down to protest state budget cuts and to make a point of emphasizing that at least those people believe that budget cutting and reductions in programs have gone as far as they can. That's House Speaker Tom Stivers in the chair. He's just appointing a committee of legislators to, as we said, wait on the governor and elected officials and bring them into the chamber. Following the governor's speech today, which is expected to run in the neighborhood of 20 or 25 minutes, I will be joined here just off the House floor on the third floor of the State House by the political editor of the Idaho Statesman newspaper in Boise, Rod Grammer, who will provide us with some analysis and reaction to the speech. My colleague Gene McNeil will be just off the House floor to gain reaction from lawmakers as they leave. Here now is the committee escorting in the members of the State Supreme Court, led by the new Chief Justice Charles Donaldson. Justice Bakes, Justice Beislein right behind him. Justice Robert Huntley. Here, just off the House floor, are the elected officials, State Superintendent of Public Instruction Jerry Evans, who will be joining us also later on for his reaction to the governor's speech, which contains a good deal of the governor's thinking on the state's educational system and what needs to be done to maintain that system. There are the elected officials, Secretary of State Pete Senarusa, State Treasurer Marjorie Ruth Moon, State Auditor Joe Williams, Mr. Evans, and new Attorney General Jim Jones.
The Speaker welcomes the elected officials of the state of Idaho, and please have them escorted to the front of the chamber.
There is, of course, new legislative leadership this year. The man that you just heard speaking, Tom Stivers, the new Speaker of the House from Twin Falls, and a new Senate leader as well, Jim Risch of Boise, the Senate President Pro Tem. The elected officials are filing in and receiving greetings from members of the House and Senate. A lot of activity around here today in a sort of housekeeping way, not much in the way of substantive legislative business. That won't happen for a day or so yet, as the new lawmakers and the veterans as well get settled. And here comes the governor, being escorted by the Senate Majority Leader, Marc and the House Majority Leader, Jack Kenevic, and the minority leaders from both bodies. That's Senator Ricks just in front of the governor.
I have the distinct honor of presenting His Excellency, the Governor of the great state of Idaho, the Honorable John Evans.
The gallery here is packed as it always is for this speech. The governor receiving greetings from the lawmakers, and also a truly packed house here today. Virtually every seat taken, certainly every seat taken, and people standing several rows deep.
You may please come forward and take your place.
Now the governor makes the walk down through the well of the House. He'll mount the podium and traditionally receive the greetings of the two presiding officers of the legislature, the Speaker of the House, Tom Stivers, and the President of the Senate, Lieutenant Governor David Leroy. And once again, Speaker Stivers will make the introduction. Here's the Governor of Idaho, the Honorable John V. Evans.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, Mr. Chief Justice and Justices of the Supreme Court, our elected state officials,
members of the 47th Idaho Legislature, ladies and gentlemen, and my fellow Idahoans. It is my pleasure once again to welcome you to our capital city and to this 1983 session of the Idaho Legislature. I just hope that you enjoyed the inaugural ceremonies last Saturday, plus the beautiful inaugural ball Saturday evening as much as my wife Lola and I did. The standard comment of most guests was that they had never seen the Capitol building so beautiful, and I have to agree. Each year when the Idaho Legislature convenes, we talk about the importance of the decisions to be made in the days ahead. And it's always true. Every legislature is called upon to make important decisions, and every legislature can be credited with major accomplishments. But this will be no ordinary session. I sincerely believe that those of you meeting here in the 47th Legislature in the year 1983 will be asked to make some of the most important decisions ever made in the history of the state of Idaho. Truly, we are at a crossroads. It is you, ladies and gentlemen, who will decide whether we take the strong and aggressive action necessary to move Idaho ahead into the new and potentially prosperous age of technology, or whether we close off some opportunities for our citizens by refusing to take that action. What we all do together during the next 60 days will determine how our children and our grandchildren will live for many years into the future. During my State of the State message here a year ago, I spoke of the need for the revitalization of our Idaho economy. I described the natural and human resources that have provided the foundation for our past economic strength. I emphasized that these resources are still the main building blocks of our economy. I also spoke of the need to introduce some new diversification into that solid economic base. And we've already begun that process by expanding our tourist and visitor industry, the one bright spot in our economy this last year. I told you what my administration had done and was continuing to do to attract the rapidly growing electronics and high technology industry into our state. We are just beginning to see the potential economic benefits possible from the location of that industry within our borders. I also spoke to you about the importance of expanding our international trade. Exports are becoming more and more important, not only to our national economy, but to Idaho's economy as well. The future prosperity of our state depends on this diversified economic base. Expanded international trade will provide us with the needed new markets for our agriculture, mining, and forest products. The tourist and visitor industry will continue to bring the outside dollars into Idaho. And the electronics and high technology industry will increase job opportunities for our citizens. But let me remind you that we live in a highly competitive modern world. Not only must we compete with our sister states for the high-tech industries, but we also must compete with other nations and other states for the tourist and visitor dollar and for our share of the markets for Idaho's products. Now is not the time to pull back and draw the wagons into a protective and limiting circle. It is time to move ahead and make the necessary investments into the future of our great state. We must invest in our human resources by providing an excellent educational system for our children, for our youth, for all of our citizens. We must ensure our future economic stability by providing essential government programs and public services, and we must be willing to provide adequately for those who can't provide for themselves. It is imperative that we make these investments now if we are to achieve our goal of jobs for Idahoans and a rich, full life for all of our citizens. If we hesitate or refuse to make these investments in our people and in our state, we will find ourselves left behind in the dust of the more ambitious states, willing to make that investment and move out ahead of us. Ladies and gentlemen, the decisions you will make during the next 60 days are crucial. The education of our people is the first responsibility of state government, as all of you recognize that have been here before. A well-educated population is by far the most valuable of all of our natural resources. Every one of our traditional or potential industries is critically dependent upon a sound educational system. For our agricultural industry, research at the universities has made it possible for our #1 industry to maintain its competitive edge. Idaho's family farmers need the agricultural research and extension services. This is too critical a program to target for elimination. Our forestry and mining industries also rely upon our colleges and universities for the scientists, the engineers, and the professionally trained and skilled individuals essential to those industries. The tourism and visitor industry needs people who are trained in business, marketing, hotel management, communications, and even the arts. In international trade, again, there's the need for people with marketing skills and the knowledge of international affairs and banking, as well as the ability to communicate in foreign languages. In the 1980s, because of the increasingly technical nature of the future employment base, human capital will become more important than financial capital in the economic development. While Idaho has been fortunate to enjoy a reputation for high productivity in our workforce, we run the serious risk of losing this status if we do not act to meet the challenge of high technology for this decade and beyond. We must train our workforce in the new skills. The high-tech industries can use all of the trained people our schools and universities can produce. Idaho students are aware of the demand for these technical skills, and they want to acquire them. However, as a result of budget restrictions, Idaho's post-secondary vocational technical schools have had to turn away students from 30% of their programs. That's each year for the past 3 years. 166 students were denied admittance to Boise State University's electronic program this fall. 145 students were turned away from the data processing classes, and another 112 from their industrial electronics program at North Idaho College. And at Idaho State University also had to close its data processing classes to 120 more students. Idaho has been fortunate to have teachers and administrators and school boards who have stretched every dollar practically into two. But just as there is no fat left to cut out of state government, there are no frills left to cut out of education either. One school principal recently told me that he's now in the process of combining 2 elementary grades into the same classroom. My fellow elected officials, we are long since past the days when the one-room classroom was the norm, yet our willingness to underfund this most basic government service seems to indicate that some of us want to return to the good old days. Not I. And we are losing good people from our schools and universities, particularly our science and math teachers who are being offered lucrative programs and positions in the private sector. Quality teachers set high standards for themselves, and we would not expect anything less. And yet we are reluctant to support their education and their dedication with adequate funding. Faculty like the Dean of the School of Engineering at the University of Idaho are leaving Idaho because we are not providing the resources for them that they need to do their best job. The failure to commit appropriate resources to education not only penalizes our young people, but it jeopardizes our present economic stability and our potential economic growth. If we are to succeed and our potential economic growth grow, and to attract those new industries to Idaho, to provide more jobs for Idahoans, we must be able to provide evidence of our commitment to excellence in education. Unfortunately, our per capita expenditure on public schools indicate the contrary. Idaho is 47th in the nation, with only Alabama, Arkansas, and Mississippi spending less than we do per student. Idaho educators have been doing their best job to maintain quality in the face of these declining resources. A year ago, the State Board of Education undertook a study of the quality in our schools through their Commission on Excellence in Education. This month, the State Board will take final action to upgrade the high school graduation requirements and to increase the standards for English, math, and sciences in our schools. Idaho's business and industry also recognize the need for excellence in education. One business recently came to the aid of our educational system by helping to develop a semiconductor technician program here at Boise State University. With the advice of some of our business leaders and through faculty exchanges and equipment donations, we've also accelerated the growth of our engineering programs at our universities. Very much needed. Business and industry are now financing a study of our post-secondary educational system. This study will not be completed until later this year, yet already their consultants on finance are highlighting the inadequacy of Idaho's higher education funding. We cannot continue to ask for greater and greater commitment to excellence from our educational institutions and from our teachers, while refusing to make the necessary financial commitment to those institutions and to those teachers. We must also be willing to provide the other basic government services that are essential to the quality of life and to the growth of business and industry, our roads and sewers and water and police and fire protection, and on and on and on. We cannot continue to cut back on these basic services to our citizens, both corporate and individual. Yes, government should be lean and efficient, but not done away with altogether. Government agencies have been created to provide a legitimate and essential service to our citizens. In order for them to provide their services efficiently and effectively, government agencies must be adequately funded. But we have been heading in the other direction. Persistent reductions of revenues and cutbacks in budgets have jeopardized the ability of government agencies to deliver the services that are required by law that they provide. Since 1977, the percentage of an individual's income paid in taxes to state and local government has decreased by 22%. Let me just repeat that for you. Since 1977, the percentage of an individual's income paid in taxes to state and local government has decreased by 22%. And at the same time, Idaho's local governments have suffered severe reductions in federal assistance. In 1978, for every $100 raised by local government, they received $47 from the federal government. In 1980, they received $32. Today, that amount has decreased still further. To compound the problem, we have placed limitations on the amount of the property taxes local governments can collect and spend, while at the same time prohibiting local government from reaching out to any other revenue source. This has forced local governments to curtail the important services they provide, principally police and fire protection, sewer treatment, maintenance of our local road systems. The Association of Idaho Cities recently conducted a survey of 16 of the largest city street systems in Idaho. Some 57% of the city streets were ranked from fair to very poor, which meant that they needed reconstruction, resurfacing, or rehabilitation completely. And 38 water systems in Idaho have been identified as needing major improvements at an estimated cost of $11 million. The problem doesn't end there. It extends to inadequate fire stations, libraries, prisons, jails, court facilities, and other buildings, and on and on. Reductions in property tax revenues also have limited financial support to our school districts. To partially offset this loss of local property tax revenue, state government has increased the state's share of public school funding through our existing sales and income taxes. However, because of the recent drastic shortfalls in state revenues, I have had to cut back severely on the other state services while trying to maintain state support for public schools. Further cutbacks in state government programs essential to the health, safety, and well-being of our citizens are no longer feasible. To further complicate the problem for local governments, Idaho's population grew by more than 32% during the 70s. This growth enormously increased the demand for government services. Population growth and the subsequent demand for our services is projected to continue through the 1980s. So local governments have been faced with record growth, loss of federal assistance, and a limitation of their ability to raise local property taxes. In addition, we've deprived them of the ability to look elsewhere for new revenue. Past legislative sessions have declined to allow local governments to turn to any other tax source other than the property tax. Local option sales taxes, local option income taxes, and a wide range of other innovative financing alternatives have been proposed, but none have been acceptable. Instead, local governments are forced to depend almost solely upon that property tax for their revenues. At both the state and local levels, we have restricted and whittled away at our tax base to the point that it no longer yields the revenues it once did. For example, we have virtually eliminated the corporate state income tax. Until recently, Idaho's tax structure had been nationally recognized as being balanced and progressive. But with the burden being shifted from corporate and individual income tax to sales and property taxes, we are in danger of losing the balance that has caused our system to be so highly regarded. In my budget message, I outlined some changes in the tax structure that will help to correct these growing inequities. I recommended closing our tax loopholes in the income tax, expanding the sales tax to include services, adopting quarterly payments for the estimated income taxes, adopting the new Internal Revenue Service Code, and making other adjustments in the income tax rate structure to compensate for the tax breaks granted last year. I hope you will seriously consider the merits of that tax plan. I also recommended a new approach dealing with local government financing and the problems they face. We need to create a state to local government revenue sharing program. The concept of the new federalism is changing the relationship of the federal and state governments. We're assuming greater responsibilities at this level. We must begin to adapt that same concept to the relationship between state government and Idaho's local governments. I propose that we permanently increase the sales tax by 1 cent Half of those revenues from that tax would go directly to the cities and counties with no strings attached. Let's trust the people of Idaho to run their own government in their own cities and in their own counties. The remaining half of the revenue generated by that 1 penny increase in the sales tax should go directly to education. Let's call it a local government and education sales tax and dedicate it to these basic of all basic programs. In addition to our responsibilities to provide education and public facilities, state government also has a third basic responsibility, and that's to provide the assistance to those of our citizens who cannot provide for themselves. Further cuts in the social service program will result in enormous hardships for those least able to endure them: the poor, the elderly, and the severely handicapped. We must assure that those of our elderly who can do so are allowed to live out their senior years with dignity and the security of their own homes. And for those elderly who need nursing home care, we must make sure that that care is available to them. We must be willing to provide training to the disabled so they will be better prepared to compete in today's job market. And for the severely handicapped who need institutional care, we must not fail in our responsibility to provide that kind of good quality care. And we have the responsibility for ensuring that dependent children and their families receive adequate food, shelter, and clothing until such times as those families are able to get on their feet once again by themselves. Let me conclude. Ensuring the quality of life for all Idahoans and the economic health of our state will require strong, compassionate, and responsible leadership. In my budget, in this message today, I have presented recommendations that will allow us to continue our commitment to excellence in education, to provide for the public services needed for our economic growth and stability, and to fulfill our legal and moral responsibilities to the poor, the elderly, and the severely handicapped. I ask you to carefully consider the recommendations I have made. We must put political differences aside and consider only the needs of our citizens and the future of our state. It is you, ladies and gentlemen, of this 47th Idaho Legislature who will determine the direction our great state will take for many years into the future. I know you're aware of that, and I am confident you will take the appropriate actions necessary to ensure Idaho's future well-being. I look forward to working very closely with you during the next 60 days to achieve that goal. Thank you very much.
Well, there you have it, the 7th State of the State speech of Idaho Governor John Evans. This is the 7th time the governor has appeared before a joint session of the Idaho House and Senate to deliver the speech that traditionally begins the legislative session. And the governor there shaking hands with the state's elected officials and members of the Senate and House as he is escorted from this really packed House chamber today the first day of the 47th session of the Idaho legislature. The governor being escorted by leadership of both the House and Senate from both sides of the aisle. He delivered a speech that ran just a little over 25 minutes. It was interrupted by applause 6 different times, including what must be a first for the governor appearing before a Republican-dominated Idaho legislature, and that was applause for his suggestion that the state should increase the sales tax. The governor, in some of the highlights of the governor's speech, he said the state is at a crossroads. He repeatedly urged lawmakers during the course of that speech this afternoon to move ahead to deal with the new technology and educational challenges that face the state. He asked them not to draw their wagons into a circle, as he put it. He urged an investment in a quality educational system in Idaho. He specifically mentioned agricultural research programs at the University of Idaho in Moscow. He said any talk of reducing those programs or eliminating them, as some Republicans have suggested, would be ridiculous. He got applause for that as well. He said students were increasingly being turned away from high technology classes in data processing and electronics programs. He said if the state is to be a technological leader and education is to be a technological leader, we must have those programs. He mentioned that Idaho is 47th in per pupil expenditures for public schools, and he invoked what must be one of the most widely used governmental catchphrase words these days, that being infrastructure. He talked about the need to spend money for roads, water projects, and public building repair. He also talked about the need for, as I mentioned, a 1-cent increase in the state sales tax, which he would make permanent. He said that the corporate and individual income taxes need attention as well, mentioning that, as he has many times since his budget speech in December, that the state has virtually done away with the corporate income tax. He also mentioned the need for state government to provide services for those who can least help themselves, presumably services in the health and welfare area. And finally, perhaps as a means of pursuing the power of positive thinking, the governor this afternoon 3 different times mentioned that he would be willing to work with the legislators during the next 60 days, which is, of course, the constitutional limit on the Idaho legislature. You won't find many people around here today who can remember the last time the legislature ended in 60 days. I checked today, it went 73 days last year, and that's about par for the course lately. Joining me now is the political editor of the Idaho Statesman newspaper in Boise, Rod Grammer, who has covered many legislatures and is back to cover another one. Rod, it seems to me that the governor has laid out a course here in this speech and also in his budget speech several weeks back that really in a very fundamental way runs directly counter to what Republicans have been talking about. Do you see it that way?
Well, Mark, one thing he's talking about is $134 million in new taxes, which would be the largest tax increase in the state's history. And that, it seems to me, certainly runs against Republican goals and wishes during a recession.
There has been some criticism in the past, and I think you've written about it and others have, that the governor has not been a good, in terms of pushing his legislative package, a good coalition builder. He called on support for local governments today, cities and counties, for increased support for public education. Is he building some coalitions, you think, that can help him push his legislative package?
Well, I don't know, Mark. He's talked about some of these coalitions in the past, or he's talked about programs that would help cities and counties in the past, but he's never been able to get local option taxes through and other things through. I think the key is to build these coalitions and convince Republican legislators, especially the leadership, that that they have to do something with the tax structure in the state, and I think that's the key to the whole thing.
The speech was politely received, not enthusiastically received. I think you'd agree with that. What does that say about the mood of this legislature as it begins?
Well, I don't think that, first of all, the speech had nothing new in it that he didn't cover in his budget address, so most of the legislators were pretty familiar with what he was saying. I don't think that they're going to greet his proposals with much enthusiasm, just as they didn't after his budget message in December.
So, without much enthusiasm, where does that leave the start of this legislature, which I mentioned at the beginning of the governor's speech, is many people think grappling with some of the most difficult problems that the state has faced in maybe 50 years?
Well, I think that the Republican leadership will be searching around for their own program. Their first problem for this session is to balance the 1983 budget. This is the first time that I know of that they've not only had to deal with next year's budget, but to do something with this year's budget.
Right.
And I think that's their first thing that I think they'll focus their attention on 84. But I think they're going to try to come up with their own agenda for both those budgets.
With the governor's ideas apparently being so counter to the Republican legislative leadership's ideas, does that set up some sort of well, I hate to call it a stalemate on the first day of the legislature, but I haven't seen in the time that I've covered the Idaho legislature so much difference even before a legislative session begins.
I think that's true. I don't think that, I think both sides at this point are trying to soft pedal their differences, but the differences are there inherently, differences in philosophy, and I think that over the next few weeks we're going to see this stalemate perhaps move from the back burner to the front burner and become a very hot issue.
I also mentioned earlier on that we have new legislative leadership this year, really a host of new people, a new speaker, a new Senate President Pro Tem, new majority leaders in both bodies, a new Democratic minority leader as well in the Senate, and about 1/3 of the membership of this legislature, slightly less than 1/3, are brand new people, have never been here before. What does that say?
Well, that means that, first of all, I think the leadership will get along as good as they ever have, because on the Senate side, James Risch and Kermit Kabir are close personal friends, as well as starting the legislature together as freshmen. On the House side, you have Jack Kinnovic and Mel Hammond, who I think will be able to work well together. I think that the number of new faces in the legislature means two things. First of all, it means an opportunity for the governor to present his case to relatively fresh people who haven't heard these issues before and haven't heard his positions. The second thing that it does is it really gives leadership kind of a headache, because they don't know these people. They've never worked with these people before. They don't know when they may break ranks. So I think for the governor, it's a good thing. For leadership, it's too early to tell, but it could cause problems.
So do you see this, will this legislature have time to do anything other than deal with these awesome budget problems? There are a number of issues that groups and individuals would like to see them deal with, but will they have much time for anything other than grappling with these truly monumental budget problems?
I think we'll see most of the attention focused on the budget, but I think you'll also see some things like tougher drunken driving laws and things like that coming to the forefront. It seems like when budget is the problem, that it usually takes leadership, and the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, most of their time, leaves many other members of the legislature with a lot of time to introduce their pet bills, and I think we'll see many of those bills again this year.
Okay. Rod, if you'll stand by for just a moment. I believe my colleague Gene McNeil is in the House lobby right now with the Senate President Pro Tem, Jim Risch, to get some of his reaction to what the governor has said here today. Gene?
Well, Mark, as you said, I am down here in front of the House chambers with Senator Risch. Senator Risch, let me ask you first, any surprises in that speech?
Really, none at all, Gene. I think it's the first time that he has come down foursquare in favor of a permanent 1-cent sales tax. I really don't see much enthusiasm for that in the legislature at this point. Other than that, there really weren't any surprises.
What kind of a mood do you think he set for the session?
Well, I think it's been pretty much along the lines of discussions we've had in the past. We come at the problem a little bit differently, but generally his speech was very much along lines that we've discussed previously.
Senator, the governor seems fairly firm in saying that there just is no more place to cut out of state government. No more fat left in government, no more frills left in education. You and other Republican leadership seem fairly firm on the other side, that there is room, that you don't want to change the corporate tax structure, that you don't want a permanent sales tax. Are we at a stalemate the first day of the session?
Not really. This is typical of the posturing that goes on early in the session. I would say that to resolve the problem, of course, somewhere in the middle is usually an appropriate place to wind up, and that very well could be what happens when all the dust settles.
So you don't see at this point too much enthusiasm for the governor's proposals, but gradually some of it could become acceptable?
Well, I think that depending upon which proposal you're talking about, there's going to be some compromises, obviously. I don't think one of the compromises will be a permanent tax increase, though.
Clearly, some of the ideas for making cuts that have been suggested aren't being met with too much enthusiasm? Agricultural research, for example.
Well, none of those cuts have been suggested at all. We've made a list of areas to study. That list has been expanded. Some things have been stricken off, but we are looking at every program, every expenditure, every agency. But to say that we have a specific proposals for cutting, that is not the case at this point.
60-day session, Senator?
I'd like to see it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see if we can get some other reaction here. Senator Little, come on. If you can wait just for a moment, Senator Cabrera, we'll have a couple of moments. Let me ask you.
We're back here in the just off the House chamber, and I'm joined now by State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Jerry Evans. Mr. Evans, the governor said, talked a lot about education in his speech today, saying, among other things, that there were no frills to cut from education any longer. Can you convince your Republican colleagues that that's the case?
I think over time it will become very clear to them. This is not the kind of an issue that splits on a party line vote. People on both sides of the political aisle really want their children to receive a quality educational program, and when the chips are down, they'll come through with what it takes to deliver that.
You pleased by what the governor said?
I was pleased in that he focused on education with as much time as he did. I found some comfort in his reference to the first responsibility of state government. It goes back to what I've been saying about the Constitution of our state, where it spells out the duty of the legislature to create and maintain a thorough and efficient system of free common schools. I was a little surprised that he didn't have more detail with respect to how we might get out of the fiscal 83 problem, but he did have some details in terms of fiscal 84, so I couldn't find an awful lot to disagree with.
All things considered, Mr. Evans, is it going to be more difficult for public schools and the constituency that represents to get what you want from this legislature this year? More difficult perhaps than it typically is.
I don't think the members of the legislature are less supportive of education. I think the circumstances they have to deal with make it more difficult. When you look at the various estimates of revenue that seem to be floating around, even though that's not yet agreed upon, the circumstances that we find ourselves in certainly will make it difficult.
Well, Mr. Evans, thank you very much for joining us. Back on the just outside the House chamber now, Jean McNeil has the co-chairman of the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee with her. Jean?
Thank you, Mark. With me are the co-chairman, Appropriations Committee Chairman Kitty Guernsey of Boise and Finance Committee Chairman Dave Little of Emmett. Let me ask both of you, first of all, the governor was fairly firm in the basic message of his speech. There is no fat left to cut in state government. There is no frills left in education. Let me ask you first, Representative Guernsey. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes, I agree with it. It certainly is a matter of opinion, and I agree with him that this legislature is going to decide the future of Idaho, of what we will provide in services. Certainly, we're always going to have those who want to cut out a certain program, but when we get ready to cut that program out, we always seem to find a constituency for that program.
So not too many places for cuts?
Well, not many that I see. When we give so much of our money to education, the only way we can cut is to cut education.
Senator Little, how about you?
Well, I think that's right. I think education is the one that has been left untouched, public schools, that is. But I still can't keep in mind the people out there that elected me. And during the campaign, nobody was for any tax increase. And we have our agriculture operating at 50% of parity. These people are needing help out there. And I don't think that we can go on as usual. I think we'll have to get less. I was in Phoenix just this week. They're talking of cutting their schools from 6 classes a day to 4. And other states have the same problem. And I think, yes, I think state government's going to have to take his reduction right along with everybody else and all the rest of us.
Can public schools take the cut, or is it going to have to go back on the property taxes?
Well, I'm sure they can take the cut if the money isn't there. We all have to.
You know, there are some proposals always that maybe you cut back, and one would be that all the state employees would work a 38-hour week. Possibly we might have to do something like that in areas of education as well. However, their present contract will not allow us to do that this year.
Let me ask both of you finally. The governor is pretty firm, as I said, in not wanting to see any more cutbacks. Republican leadership at this point seems pretty firm in not wanting at least a permanent tax increase. Are we headed toward a stalemate, Senator Little?
Oh, I don't think so. I think as we get going along and we get more input from the people out in our legislative world, those people that elected, I think that this will get resolved as we right now, just as of today, but I think we'll probably all have some second thoughts as we go along, including the governor.
Are you concerned about a stalemate?
No, I'm not concerned about a stalemate. I think the best thing we could do to speed the process would probably have our committee come in with a $400 million budget or a $375 million budget or whatever it is. And I think the day that the people realize what that would really mean to education and to services in this state, then I think this would take care of the stalemate. And at that time, we'd make some decisions.
Well, we'll be watching that process. Thank you both very much. Mark, back to you.
Thank you, Gene. With me is Jim Weatherby, who is one of the top officials in the Association of Idaho Cities, the lobbying group, among other things, for cities in this state. Mr. Weatherby, the governor talked a good deal about the needs of local government today. I assume that you find that pleasing.
Very pleasing, Mark. We have been concerned over the past several months with all the discussion in the media about the shortfall at the state level, that the local government needs were going to not be recognized, not be addressed in this session. We're certainly heartened that the governor addressed the local government needs as well as the state needs and the needs of education.
Is a state to local government revenue sharing plan, would that go a long way towards solving the problems that the cities say they have?
We think it would. In fact, we will have a proposal to bring to the legislature this session to do pretty much what the governor suggested in terms of a permanent revenue sharing program that will dedicate funds to both cities and counties.
I think it's safe to say, Mr. Weatherby, that cities have not always got what they want from the Idaho legislature in terms of a tax structure. The governor mentioned local option proposals, as you well know, that have gone literally nowhere in the past. Are you more optimistic that in light of this retrenched economy that cities are going to get some of the things that you want this time?
Well, you're very kind in saying we didn't get all we wanted before. Being ranked 50th in terms of local discretionary authority indicates we've gotten very little in terms of the local revenue needs that we've isolated and emphasized over the past several years. We think that this state revenue sharing program does have some support among the legislators that we have talked with. I think they're beginning to understand the needs of cities and counties and local units of government. It's no longer a matter of us having to go before the legislature and demonstrate the need. I think they understand it now, and we think that the governor and a number of legislators are going to come forth with proposals and mechanisms whereby the need can be addressed.
Mr. Weatherby, thank you for coming by and joining us today. Gene McNeil has some Democratic reaction to the governor's speech from the Senate Minority Leader, Kermit Kibert. Gene?
Thank you, Mark. Senator Kibert, first of all, let me ask you whether you believe the governor generated any new enthusiasm for his proposals here this afternoon.
Well, I think that the governor's speech was very sincere and to the point. As far as generating new enthusiasm, I think the enthusiasm is there. People understand the problems that are out there, particularly with respect to the budgetary crunch that we're in. So as far as enthusiasm, I think the legislature has it, and I think we're prepared to go to work on it.
The governor is proposing a rather dramatic package, the largest package of revenue increases in the history of the state. How solid is legislative Democratic support for that package?
Well, personally, I think that there's good support throughout the Democratic caucuses. When we talk about increases, we're talking about not necessarily new taxes, but we're talking about some of those taxes that are presently on the books but aren't being collected. So as far as you notice, the governor spoke of only one new tax, and that being the 1 cent. The rest of these, the revenues would be those that are out there, loopholes, the quarterly tax adjustment, the jobs credit adjustment, and so forth.
Plans given to the corporations in the last session, though.
That's right. As far as I'm concerned, I believe the business community is going to be very responsible. They like the rest of us, don't want to see the underpinnings pulled from under education and they're going to make sure that that education is treated well as the other services in state government.
You see probably some sort of compromise down the road?
Oh, I certainly do. I think that you're going to look at hopefully a very apolitical session where people work in a responsible, cooperative, productive manner.
Thank you, Senator Caber. Let me get some quick reaction here from Representative Steve Antone. I just promoted you, the chairman of the Revenue and Taxation Committee in the House. How do you think your committee is likely to react to the proposal of an increased sales tax?
I think there's some general acceptance of that because people are afraid to let the tax go back to the property owners, and that's going to happen if some measure isn't taken to raise some revenues at the state level.
What about the governor's contention that the whole tax structure is getting to the point of being out of balance and needs some real overhaul?
Well, I think he's probably right in some phases of that it is getting a little heavy towards property tax and to individual income tax.
Will the legislature really take on that job this year?
I couldn't say that. I have a new committee. Most of it, there are 5 members on my committee are new, and I don't know what their reactions will be, but I am sure that there will be some good reception for a sales tax increase to save the property owners from an increase in their taxes.
Finally, let me ask you about a proposal that something the governor did not mention, the 50-50 homeowners initiative that passed this last November. Some talk of doing something with that. What would you see likely to happen there?
There are 2 or 3 bills floating around about the 50-50 initiative, and I think there probably will be some changes made in it. We did a lot last year to encourage business to come to Idaho, and the 50-50 initiative is going to be a detriment to business coming into Idaho, and I think we will have to look at it. In the long run, the homeowner isn't going to benefit that much from the 50-50 because they do lose that part of their property tax as a deduction on their income tax. They'll pay a little bit more federal, a little bit more state. Their groceries are going to cost more. Their power is going to cost more because those businesses have to.
Not a good a deal as for the homeowners as it looked like.
It really isn't as good as it sounds.
Thank you, Representative Antone. Back to you, Marc.
Thank you, Gene. Rod Grammer, Kermit Caber said an apolitical session. Is that likely?
No, I don't think so, Marc.
Everything is apolitical on the first day.
I kind of got a chuckle out of that. The governor said, let's settle this without politics. Well, this whole session is going to be politics, politics, politics. It's the way the game's played here, and I think we'll see a political session.
Just in a word, who's going to be the people to watch in this session in terms of power? Who's got the clout? Who's going to move this session, do you think?
Well, ironically, it could be the newcomers because, as Steve Antone said, he has 5 new members on his committee, and he doesn't know how they're going to come down. But I think you have to look at the leadership, too. James Risch, Tom Stivers, for the leadership of this session.
Rod Grammer, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. That's our coverage of the governor's 1983 State of the State speech, the 7th such speech that John Evans has given to a joint session of the House and Senate, the Idaho Legislature. We'll be back at 7 o'clock Mountain Time, 6:30 Pacific Time tonight with our first broadcast on Legislature 83 from the state capitol. For Gene McNeil, I'm Marc Johnson in Boise. Good afternoon.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.